Welcome to another episode of the Conversations With series. Today, we're excited to have Professor Caroline Elliott from the University of Warwick. Caroline, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So we'll start off with a round of introductions. So could you please tell us a bit more about the courses you teach, your areas of interest, and a fun fact about yourself?
Okay, so I'm a professor in the economics department at the University of Warwick. I've only been at Warwick for around 9 months. Previously, I was working as Deputy Dean of Aston Business School. I'm an industrial economist, so it's probably not a surprise that I'm teaching a third-year industrial economics module, and also I'm teaching on the MSc Industrial Economics module. I'm also Deputy Director of the Economics Network, which is a UK body that works to enhance the quality of university economics teaching across the UK and increasingly beyond the UK as well. And in terms of my fun fact, I'm going to say that until I was around 18, I had no intention of being an economist. I wanted to be a professional viola player. And then in my final year at school, it suddenly occurred to me that actually I was a lot better at economics than I was at music, and I switched career choice and did PPE instead as my degree.
That's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that with us. So yeah, a bit more on the economic side. So we know you're working on a series of books about practical advice on how to teach. So we're wondering if you could tell us, your top 2 tips on how to teach.
Okay, so tip number 1, it's very important to be yourself. So once I realized I didn't want to be a professional viola player, I wanted to be an economist. I think when I went to university, I looked at lecturers and thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be an academic too. I want to explain economics to students. And then I became a lecturer. And for the first couple of lectures that I gave, I tried to be a lecturer like the lecturers I'd had as a student. So I stood at a lectern and tried to be very serious, because my lecturers were, and thought, I hate this. Why did I want this job? This is awful. And so for lecture 3, I decided to stop acting how I thought a lecturer should behave. And I just was myself, and I was much more comfortable interacting with the students more, maybe taking a more informal approach, improvising, giving students additional examples when I thought of them. And then I really enjoyed lecturing, and then I realized it was the right career choice for me. So my first tip is to always be yourself, and that means embrace your own teaching style. My second tip would be not to be afraid of technology. So at a number of points in my career, I've tried using different technologies, and I found that students are very sympathetic. So I've tried a number of technologies. Often they work. Sometimes things go wrong. But if students know why you introduce an innovation and why you try an innovation with them, they tend to be more sympathetic and more understanding if things go wrong. And so I wouldn't say that usually I was the most technologically sophisticated person. My son would say I'm definitely not, but still, I've found that I've used quite a lot of technologies in my teaching that I hope have really worked for me, but also more importantly have worked for the students and ensured their engagement with modules as well.
No, yeah, that's really great advice. So on the topic of technology, a lot of the teaching had to take place virtually this year and last year because of the pandemic. So how did you adapt your teaching methods to the online environment? And what were some of the advantages and disadvantages you found of this new format?
I think the main thing was that I'd never pre-recorded lecture material before. So I know I've got lots of colleagues who use a flipped classroom approach, where they would often have recorded segments of material, particularly on very technical material. And I'd always thought, oh, that would be a good thing to do, but I'd never quite got round to doing it. And this year, we've all been forced to make pre-recorded materials. Now that I've done that and I've got used to, you know, talking to my laptop with me in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, I think I will always continue doing that, even if we go back to face-to-face lectures one day. I think I will always have pre-recorded material available to students on the most technical material that they cover with me, so that they can always go back over the maths of a particular topic or particularly complicated diagrams. So that's something that I will always do. I think the one thing that I've really enjoyed this year that surprised me was that in an online lecture environment, I think the students were much more comfortable asking questions. So I've always said to the students in lectures, has anyone got any questions? And sometimes there's that awkward silence, and sometimes one or two people might tentatively raise their hands. And this year you say, any questions? And often the chat bar fills up and students seem much more comfortable using the chat function to ask questions. And that's been really nice. The related tip is that you have to give them a moment or two to type in the questions. So the chat bar doesn't fill up immediately. It takes a minute or two for them to type the questions. But I think that's what I've particularly enjoyed, that additional interaction with students online, even in a lecture. So I feel that I'm able to answer a lot more of their questions in the online lecture environment.
And are there any other ways you've tried to maintain student engagement? Because a lot of students just have their cameras off, very passive. So have you done anything to kind of bring those students out?
So in online lectures, yes, they tend to have their cameras off. And I can understand that, and I have sympathy for that. So what I try to do is get to an online lecture a few minutes early, and then there will always be a few students who join early as well. And I'll say to them, even if you don't want to keep your camera on for the online lecture, which is anyway recorded, if you turn your camera on now before the lecture starts and wave at me, and then I know you're there. And so then I've got this image of the students in my mind, so that I'm talking to them even when their cameras are off. The other thing that I only started using as we moved to online teaching, but I've really enjoyed using, is a Padlet. So that seems a really great way of getting feedback from multiple students simultaneously. For example, I'll have given them an empirical article to read, and I'll get them all to put their thoughts on that paper on a Padlet. And if I think they're going to be shy, I can do that anonymously so that they're not all named. But that's worked really well. So I think that's the new technology I've used this year beyond online recorded lecture material that I've really enjoyed using.
Yeah, that sounds great. And on the topic of assessments, how have you kind of adapted them for the online setting? So have you kind of spread them out or made them open book? Or have you done something completely different?
So I've done something different for both my third year undergraduate and my master's module. I got rid of the final exams completely. Okay. So for the undergraduate students, they have a small piece of assessed work during the term when the module's taught, and that gives us an opportunity to check the quality and the level of their writing, so we can give them feedback on a piece of work that only is weighted relatively lightly in the final assessment. And for the MSc students, they do a couple of quite technical problem sets, but then for both modules, instead of a final exam, the students have to write a big individual report. So for the undergraduate module, they choose a regulated industry or a recent competition case to analyse in detail, and are expected to use materials that have been covered through the module. And for the MSc module, the students choose any firm of their choice, and again use the topics covered in the module to help them understand the strategy choices made by the firms, and to give recommendations on what future strategy choices should be. So these final assessments allow the students to choose firms and cases that are of particular interest to them. So hopefully it's interesting work for them. Both final assessments get the students to review materials that they've studied across their module in industrial economics, so that's really good. And then the other thing is that often our students when they graduate won't go on to do work that requires final exams. So it makes sense to not assess them using final exams, but to give them experience of writing professional quality reports, because often they'll be asked to do that in their graduate roles. I think the final advantage is an advantage for me in that it makes these final assessments so much more interesting to mark when all the students choose different cases and different firms, and their enthusiasm for their choices often comes out in their writing. So it actually makes marking a lot more enjoyable than when I had final exams to mark.
Now, as students, we prefer not to have final exams as well. A lot less stress for us.
Yeah.
And we also wanted to ask you about how games can be used to teach economics, and kind of what's the idea of using games to teach?
Okay, so I've used games in my teaching for years, probably going back to that very first year when I thought I don't want to teach like the way I'd been taught, and I found that games were a great way of connecting with students immediately. And I think now games are a great way of illustrating to students the difference between standard neoclassical economics and the more behavioural approaches to economics, and why there is a need for behavioural economics, because we don't always act like profit maximising firms or utility maximising individuals. So I think games are great, but they're also great to change the dynamics in classes and to make sure students feel fully involved and engaged. And they're a great way of introducing concepts to students and keeping them in students' minds. I think students often remember a concept or why a theory doesn't always work when they've seen a demonstration or they've been involved in a demonstration of that in terms of a game or experiment in class. I think the thing I'd always say to colleagues is there are some games that can be quite sophisticated, and that's great. And I know that I've got a number of colleagues this year who've been using ClassX games online with students. But often in a face-to-face context, it can be very straightforward to play a game with students using a pack of playing cards or, just pieces of paper. So colleagues don't have to be very technologically confident. We can play really simple games with students that still get the message of the games across to the students.
Yeah, that's great. And lastly, we wanted to hear a little bit more about your graduate teaching assistant workshops, kind of more specifically, what does it involve, the value it brings, and your role in it.
Okay, so the graduate teaching assistant workshops are organised by the Economics Network, and I've been involved for many years in running these. And initially we used to run these workshops as individuals, but increasingly now we run these workshops in pairs. And then it's an opportunity for the graduate teaching assistants to get two different perspectives of academics when they're involved in the workshops. And the workshops are quite informal, and they give the graduate teaching assistants an opportunity to ask questions on whatever they're worried about, because even though it was many years ago, I still remember how daunting it was walking into the classroom those first few times when you're worried, will the students behave? Will they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? So we address all these types of queries in these workshops, but as well, we give the graduate teaching assistants examples of worksheets that are set by academics at the institutions where they're going to be working, and say, okay, design the dream seminar around this worksheet, because that's often what happens. Graduate teaching assistants are given a worksheet and they're just told, this is a worksheet for this week. And so by giving them an opportunity to practice thinking about how they would design the ideal seminar around a worksheet, in that sort of safe environment where it's okay to make mistakes. I think that's really helpful to them.
No, yeah, that sounds like a really great initiative. So yeah, that's all the questions we have today for you, Caroline. Thank you for your time and having this conversation with us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Cheers.